The author of Chazdei David continues to summarize the secrets of the Arizal by describing how the Creator began to emanate all of the different worlds within the Challal that resulted from the Tzimtzum. Now, the author adds the following insights. Ve'achar kach hemshich kav echad shel or. And then, the Creator proceeded to enter one beam of light, what is known as the kav, into the Challal, Vehu sod harachamim, and in complete contrast to the Tzimtzum, this kav represents the measure of rachamim, i.e., the measure of mercy inside the Challal. Ve'al yado nithavu Igulim Ve-Yosher de-12 Partzuphim Adam Kadmon. And from this kav, all 12 Partzuphim of Adam Kadmon were formed. Not only the circular distinction known as the Igulim, but also the linear distinction known as the Ve-Yosher. ו-12 פרצופי אצילות בריאה, יצירה, עשייה. Additionally, this was also the case with regards to the formation of the circular and linear distinctions of the 12 Partzufim of the other four worlds, known as Atzilut, Beriah, Yetzirah, Asiyah, or in abbreviations, Abiyah. Now we'll proceed to analyze all of these different concepts in detail. And the very first thing that we are taught is that Ve'achar kach himshich kav echad shel or. And after that, that is to say, after the act of the Tzimtzum, during which the Creator, so to speak, withdrew His infinite light from within the area that turned into an empty, dark Challal, then the Creator inserted into this dark area kav echad shel or, one beam of light, what the Arizal calls the kav. What is this kav? In the book Etz Chaim, the Arizal clarifies that the kav should be looked at as a thin pipe of sorts, through which light flows back into the Challal from the Ein Sof, who of course still exists in his infinite state outside of the Challal. And this is why the kav is necessarily connected to the infinite light of the Ein Sof that surrounds the round Challal, in order to serve as a pipeline for the light that would re-enter the Challal after its initial withdrawal from there during the act of the Tzimtzum. And how far does this kav extend inside of the Challal? The kav actually extends to the very center of the Challal, as stated by the Arizal in Etz Chaim. And although some may disagree with this statement, nevertheless, this is how I learned this particular topic with my mentor, Rav Eyal Sheharbani Shelita, the author of this series of books called Ayelet Ahavim. Another thing that the Arizal points out in Etz Chaim regarding this kav is that it was intentionally designed to be very thin, and that was in order to limit how much light will be allowed to re-enter the Challal from the Ein Sof via the kav. After all, had the Ein Sof not limited how much light would re-enter the Challal via the kav, then the returning light would have certainly cancelled out everything that the original Tzimtzum achieved when the light was purposely withdrawn from that area in the first place. Therefore, in order to prevent that from happening, the Creator made sure that the kav would intentionally be very thin, thereby limiting how much of the original light will be allowed to return into the Challal via the kav, in order to preserve the original Tzimtzum. And now that the kav carries only a limited amount of light, we therefore find two different coexisting entities inside the Challal, which are actually completely juxtaposed to each other. What are they? On the one hand, we have inside the Challal the aspect of darkness, which resulted from the initial withdrawal of the light. This is the darkness that, so to speak, hides the Creator within the Challal. On the other hand, though, we also have inside the Challal the distinction of light that returned into the Challal via the kav in order to reveal the Creator inside that place. With that in mind, having previously taught us that the Tzimtzum was the root of the dinim, the author now informs us that the kav, or more specifically the light that re-entered the Challal via the kav, represents the rachamim, i.e. the measure of mercy inside the Challal. After all, since the light inside the Kav is the light of the Ein Sof, and since the Ein Sof is certainly the source of all the Rachamim, then we can probably take the liberty to think of the light that flows inside the Kav as, so to speak, the ambassador of the Ein Sof's measure of mercy inside of the Challal. Think about it. Yet another thing that the Arizal points out in Etz Chaim has to do with the fact that the Kav begins at the edge of the circular Challal, where it is actually connected to the Ein Sof that still resides outside of the Challal, while on the other hand, the same Kav ends in the very center of the Challal, which is obviously as far as you can get from the edge of the circular Challal. What does the Arizal point out? That as a result of that bipolar distinction, a new measuring stick was created inside the Challal. How so? Since the beginning of the Kav is obviously closer to the Ein Sof, it therefore carries more light and more Rachamim than at the end of the Kav, i.e., at the center of the Challal. And the phenomenon of this ever-decreasing light within the Kav is what creates the measuring stick that sets the stage for two completely opposite distinctions inside the Challal, such as up and down, or beginning and end, or head and feet, that we find all over the Kabbalistic literature in reference to the Sefirot and the Partzuphim. However, before the Kav entered the Challal, the only shape that we could speak of was the circular shape of the Tzimtzum, and we've already spoken in great depth about how the circle is certainly a very consistent and equal shape, what you would technically call isotropic. Therefore, regarding a circle, we certainly cannot differentiate between up and down, or between beginning and end, or between head and feet. But now that the light of Rachamim has re-entered the Challal, the Creator proceeded to emanate all of the worlds inside the Challal using the light that travels back into it via the Kav. Inasmuch, the author now informs us that using the light that travels inside the Kav, which the Arizal compared to a pipe, the Creator made all the different distinctions that make up these worlds, i.e., both the aspect of the circular Igulim and the aspect of the linear Ve-Yosher. The author begins this section by introducing the circular and linear aspects that make up the very first world, known as Adam Kadmon. And it is very noteworthy that the author chose to break down the details of Adam Kadmon into 12 Partzuphim, or more specifically, into 12 circular Partzuphim and 12 linear Partzuphim. Why is that so noteworthy? Because I expect that most of you are probably asking, what are these Partzuphim? We've all heard about the 10 Sefirot, but what are these Partzuphim? Furthermore, I expect that most of you are probably also asking about these two aspects that we keep mentioning, i.e., the circular Igulim on the one hand, and the linear Ve-Yosher on the other hand. And since we already have so many questions, we'll therefore slow down to explain these concepts one by one. We'll begin by clarifying the difference between the circular Igulim aspect and the linear Ve-Yosher aspect. You should know that the Arizal revealed the distinction between these two aspects in order to reconcile several passages in the Zohar which seem to contradict each other. But before the Arizal revealed this secret to his pupil, Rabbi Chaim Vital, all of the previous Kabbalists struggled greatly trying to reconcile how in one place the Zohar speaks of Sefirot that are organized in the shape of circles, one within the other, similar to how the layers of an onion are organized one within the other, and how in another place the Zohar speaks of Sefirot that are organized in a linear alignment, one above the other. But as we mentioned, that was only the case until the Arizal came into the scene and revealed that in truth, both of these allegorical shapes, i.e., both the circular and the linear alignment of the Sefirot, are actually true. And not only are these two alignments both true, but you should know that they are actually both true everywhere, as every Sephirah and every spiritual entity as parallel representations in both the circular and the linear dimension. So what are these circular Igulim? The most simplistic way to approach these Igulim is to point out that the Tzimtzum was also in the shape of a circle, as we learned, and since the Tzimtzum was circular, it shouldn't be hard to understand why all of the spiritual entities were also created in a circular fashion, in order to parallel the original Tzimtzum. But how do we understand the linear aspect known as the Ve-Yosher? Here too we could explain in the most simplistic fashion that since the light re-entered the Challal through the Kav, which literally means a line, and as we see, it is indeed straight and narrow and long, therefore the Creator wanted that every Sephirah and every spiritual entity will also have another aspect that would parallel the shape of the linear Kav to go along with the other shape, i.e. the shape of the circular Igulim. If so, it turns out that we have one aspect that parallels the shape of the Tzimtzum and another aspect that parallels the shape of the Kav. And since you're still wondering what a Partzuf is, I'll have you know that I actually intend on delving into a very thorough discussion about the Partzuphim in a later on point, after which we'll be able to appreciate the intimate connection that the Partzuphim have with the Sefirot, as well as why there are 12 Partzuphim in every world. But since the author already mentioned the Partzuphim at this early point, I therefore feel obligated to say at least one or two things on the topic already. Therefore, in very, very general terms, we need to know that the Partzuphim are actually different forms of behavior that the Creator adopts towards us, as the term Partzuf could be translated as facial expression. And as we know, the facial expression of human beings almost always indicates what their attitude and behavior is at that particular time. And although the Creator, and the rest of the spiritual realm for that matter, certainly doesn't have any physicality, nevertheless, it is no secret that the Torah regularly speaks about God in anthropomorphic terms, i.e. in human terms, and therefore the Kabbalists also chose to apply the concept of facial expression to the Creator's spiritual Partzufim with regards to his different forms of behavior towards us. And let us take to heart that this is actually the secret behind what Rashi wrote in his commentary to the Torah on the verse, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am Hashem your God, which of course was the very first commandment that we heard at Har Sinai. If you remember, Rashi there wanted to explain why the Almighty saw it necessary to stress that He is Hashem our God in the very beginning of the Ten Commandments, which implies that the nation of Israel could have possibly thought otherwise. Therefore, in order to explain how the nation of Israel could have possibly been mistaken, Rashi points out that until the giving of the Torah at Har Sinai, the nation of Israel were accustomed to experience the Almighty's behavior towards them in varying forms and attitudes. For example, during the time that the nation of Israel were enslaved to Paro in Mitzrayim, the Torah describes God as V'tachat raglav ke'ma'aseh livnat hasapir, and under his legs was the appearance of a sapphire brick, alluding to the bricks that they had to carry during their enslavement at that time. And later on, during the crossing of the Red Sea, the Almighty appeared to the nation of Israel as a mighty warrior who fought their great battle against Paro's dangerous army, when he split the Red Sea, allowing the nation of Israel to cross safely, and then proceeded to flood the Egyptian army. At that point, the Torah describes the Almighty as Hashem Ish Milchama, literally, God is a man of war. Additionally, Rashi also points out that during the time of redemption, the Almighty appeared to the nation of Israel as an old, merciful man, so to speak. And based on these ever-changing appearances, Rashi proceeds to clarify that this is why in the very first commandment that we heard at Har Sinai, the Almighty saw it necessary to remind, or perhaps even warn us, that although He may change the way that He appears to us, nevertheless, we should not conclude that these varying appearances are actually plural gods. The truth, of course, is that Anochi hu asher hotzeiticha memitzrayim ve'al hayam. I am the same God that took you out of Egypt and split the Red Sea for you. But once we start to scrape the surface of Rashi's famous words, we find that he was actually hinting to us about the different Partzuphim which the Almighty used during the time that Bnei Israel were enslaved in Egypt, and later on when He fought their battle during the crossing of the Red Sea, and then during their eventual redemption, as every form of behavior that the Almighty displayed is actually a different Partzuf which the Creator took on at that time. If so, then we can say that there is one Partzuf in which the Almighty reveals Himself as an old, merciful man, so to speak, and that there is another Partzuf in which the Almighty reveals Himself as a mighty young warrior who fights our battles, and that there is another Partzuf in which the Almighty reveals Himself when He wants to exact justice from the wicked, or when He wants to inflict suffering upon those who deserve it. Therefore, in order to make sure that we do not mistake these varying Partzufim to be different gods with powers of their own, it was necessary for us to hear at Har Sinai, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am Hashem your God, as certainly all of these varying appearances and forms of behavior are from the same God who created the world and took us out of Mitzrayim. But, as I said before, what we just learned was a very, very general introduction to the subject of Partzufim. However, before long, we'll surely address this very complex subject in much greater depth, and especially with regards to the intimate connection that the Partzufim have with the 10 Sefirot. But until we get to that in-depth discussion, I wanted to first impress upon you how the two aspects of these Partzufim, namely the round Igulim and the linear Ve-Yosher, relate to each other, as well as how the Igulim and the Ve-Yosher relate to the round shape of the Tzimtzum and the linear shape of the Kav. Therefore, in order to begin clarifying all of the above and much more, we'll go back to the stage before the formation of the Partzufim in the first world known as Adam Kadmon, when there was only an empty Challal in the center of the Ein Sof, and immediately after the light of Rachamim re-entered the Challal via the Kav. This is the famous Kav from which all the Partzufim of Adam Kadmon were formed, both the circular and the linear Partzufim of that world. And as I have illustrated for you here in the color blue, the very first Partzuf to be formed in that place is a completely circular sphere which almost touches the edge of the circular Tzimtzum but doesn't actually touch it. And you should know that all the light inside these circular Igulim must necessarily enter them through the linear Kav. In other words, the light from the Ein Sof enters into the Challal via the Kav and then flows in a circular fashion within these circular Partzufim that are known as the Igulim, one circular Partzuf within another, similar to how the layers of an onion are organized one within the other. However, in order to enable us to view and appreciate the linear aspect of the worlds which is necessarily situated within these circular Igulim, I therefore had to make a cross-section of these circular Igulim as we currently see in our illustration. And as we've already mentioned, for each and every circular Igul, there is another parallel representation in the other realm, i.e., in the linear realm known as the Ve-Yosher. And how does the linear Ve-Yosher aspect of the Partzufim look like? perhaps we could compare the different parts that make up the linear Yosher aspect as one pipe within another pipe, with of course the kav being the innermost pipe, while all the other pipes surround the innermost kav. And since the Zohar, as we mentioned, compared the circular Igulim to round layers of an onion which are situated one within the other, we'll also take the allegoric liberty to compare the elements that make up the linear Yosher aspect to the layers of a leek. Yes, a leek, like the one that we eat on Rosh Hashanah. And in case you're not so familiar with the makeup of a leek, you can see in the picture before you that the leek is made out of long cylindrical layers situated one within the other. And according to all of these parables, we'll soon experience by means of a long, detailed illustration how all the worlds are, so to speak, made out of a leek inside of an onion. And in case you still haven't figured out what I'm talking about, we'll therefore start off the next session with a detailed illustration and speak things out in depth and with clarity.